Hi, anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam, and Kelly will be joining us in just a moment, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an intro into today's episode. Last week, we talked about Ira Couch and Chicago City Cemetery, and you may remember that the main source I used for my research was Hidden Truths, the Chicago City Cemetery in Lincoln Park, a project by Pamela Bannos. And Pamela was gracious enough to sit down for an interview, and we just had so much fun talking with her. We ended up getting caught up in a conversation before technically starting the interview. So you guys are going to jump right in, kind of mid conversation. We were discussing Pamela's copyrights on her work, which goes from 2008 to 2021. And she starts talking about how long it actually took her to complete all of her research. We had an absolute blast talking with Pamela, and we hope that you all enjoy today's episode. I didn't quite realize that initially because I saw your copyrights, and your copyrights are extended, and so I kind of
I
just
know,
assumed you
I
were
started
working on it.
updating copyright every year. No, and that's my fault. I noticed that again because on the front page I put 2008 through to 2021, which is when I stopped doing that because then I realized I don't need to update my copyright. I'm going to default it all back to 2008, which is when it was created because I didn't do anything new since then. So I don't know why I kept changing the copyright year to the present year until I stopped, which was very arduous because there's more than 100 pages and they're not all exactly like grouped together. So
Right.
anyhow, yes, the project was launched in May 2008. After 1 year of research, well, 15 months the
Only
project
one
took me.
year. Wow.
Well,
That's
then that's
impressive
the
how much
thing.
you got done.
I should have just been part of a PhD program and I could have gotten a PhD from the research that I did and the information that I uncovered. Um, and I was doing year-long projects at that time. And I'm like, here's a project. And I scrambled to get it done. It actually took 15 months because of um, putting the markers in the park. Have you seen the markers?
Oh,
I have. I
And
drive
one
by
of
there
you
quite
said, Sam, I
frequently.
guess.
yes. Yeah.
So do you see the marker? The one that would be visible from Clark Street is behind the Kennison boulder.
Um, yeah, I'm usually driving down
That one I don't know
LaSalle.
if I've seen.
Yeah, so there's one in front of the couch tomb, which they in fact just moved and turned the way it was facing because they're doing, I think it's the History Museum is doing um, some sort of guided tour thing through the park, and they moved my marker. They just moved it out of the way from their marker. But it's funny because this wasn't supposed to be up this long. This was supposed to be a 16-month art project.
Oh,
And
really?
the community liked it so much. Yeah, and it's real history. I mean, it's got my name on it, Northwestern University. Go to my
Mm-hmm.
website. It was only meant to be a temporary installation, which it
Oh,
still
that's really cool that
technically
it's still
is.
there.
Yeah, I'm
It's
amazed.
so cool. It's so cool. Because I just am really interested in Chicago history too.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a question at the end. It's an opinion one. Like, you can always be like, who knows? Um, just about like, what books would you recommend? Or something like that. Because it's fascinating. I'm so glad it survived.
Well, it'll
Um,
be on the internet because it's on a Northwestern server, which is
Okay.
oh,
in retrospect really smart on my part. So I don't have to pay for upkeep and
There you
domain
go.
name and all my other websites that I have that I'm paying hundreds of dollars a year to maintain and keep them online. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
I did want to tell you, Pamela, I know you got the list of questions in advance, and I moved a couple of them out
that's
because
fine.
they weren't that relevant. The ones about the Kennison Memorial,
Yeah,
move them down. They weren't really, more
yeah,
context would have been needed. So
yeah.
just wanted to let you know that update.
For efficiency, yeah. I mean, he's his whole own story on his own, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I was like, I found it on your website and I was so interested. And then Sam made the good point. It's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about Ira Couch. so,
But for this episode as well. So that's the transition, the segue from your previous episode to this one is is Couch, because you did
Yeah,
ask
I
Yes.
about
guess.
if there were other tombs and such. Okay.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
definitely the main focus of
yeah.
both of the episodes for the most part. I started with Couch. I actually, when I was choosing to do that for our episode, I remember, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, I was on a ghost tour in Chicago, just like a bus tour before I even lived here. And we drove past the Couch Tomb and they mentioned it and it just stuck in my head. So I just started Googling it and I found your site. I'm like, okay, I can do more on this. There's a lot of information here. But that's where it all started
Yeah.
for me.
And that's where I started.
Um,
That's where it started for
yeah.
me as well. So yeah. Hmm.
All right,
So
I'm
we
going
could
to dive
start
into
there
our
too.
intro here and then we'll get
Sure.
to some of our questions. Hi anyone and everyone.
Sounds
Welcome
great.
to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam.
And my name is Kelly.
We have a very special guest for you today. Welcome, Pamela Bannos. Hello. Thank you for joining us today.
And I am Pamela
Hey,
Bannos.
hello.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
I hope that everyone listened to last week's episode on the Couch Tomb and Chicago City Cemetery because the majority of our research came from Pamela's website. And I said this in our intro a little bit, just kind of talking before the episode, but I really enjoyed going through your website. I wanted to dive into every individual page and make sure I just absorbed as much of the information as I could. It's just a lot of fun to go through. But before we dive into our um, relevant questions, one thing we really like to do at the beginning of every episode is ask a very basic intro question, just kind of fun and a little carefree. And knowing that you are in the Chicago area, what's one of your favorite Chicago spots?
You're going to laugh. It's Lincoln Park.
Oh, I love that.
Yay!
And
I love
I didn't
Lincoln Park.
realize until I did my project that Lincoln Park runs the entire length of Chicago along the lakefront. It's not just the
Hmm.
Lincoln Park where my project was based, which most people, I think, maybe that's like the entrance to Lincoln Park, but Lincoln Park goes all the way. And I also didn't realize that all of that is built up land. None of that was the original coastline of Chicago. So I really like Lincoln Park, and especially since I did this project, I spent a lot of days wandering in the area of my project, trying to visualize the cemetery and standing in different spots and looking at the ground and seeing how there were ridges and trying
Oh,
little
wow.
tricks that an archaeologist taught me. Like there was a light
Oh,
snow, and I ran to I like drove really fast to get there because he said when there's a light snow, you can sometimes see little divots, which would be
Oh,
graves,
interesting.
because when you dig a grave and then there's something there and then the ground collapses, that there's slight
So
little
then the
variations to
compact,
the surface.
yeah.
So I spent a lot of time just sort of being there and imagining the place during that time. So that's the place I keep going back to, obviously.
that's
Oh, I
so
love that.
fascinating. The archaeologist input there.
Yeah. I talked to a lot
That
of different people for this project that knew more about different specifics that I asked them questions. And those interviews, which I was calling podcast, well, there's a series of podcasts. This is funny. It's 2007 that I'm making this. And I don't think we knew well, it's not the same as what a podcast is today. But I made six recordings, 10 minutes each, that go with each of the historical markers that I put in the park. And if you download them, you could actually take an hour tour of the park,
Oh, that's
listening to me
awesome.
talk about the point of where you're standing. This is 2007. I was way ahead of my time in
Oh,
making
you
this.
absolutely.
were.
Yeah, yeah. And
That is
beyond
so
that,
cool.
my website is full of hyperlinks, which is like the first time
Hmm.
people were using those to like direct you to other places. And it's a big, messy story, which is why um, that became the way I did it, and why I was supposed to write a book about this at some point, but I couldn't figure out the right way to tell it because there's so many different directions that you could go. And the website turns out to be, in many ways, the best possible way to let any person explore whatever they're interested in, get lost down the rabbit hole of that trajectory, which is what I hear from people. Because then they
Yeah.
ask me
Yeah.
a question, I'm like, "Oh, that's on the website." And they're like, "I thought I saw the whole thing." No, there's actually like 10 more pages about, yeah,
Well, it's hard to
so,
tell the story chronologically because there's so many different stories happening at once throughout all of it.
right,
I personally love a
exactly.
hyperlink. Kelly can tell you this when I write my scripts and my notes. I love a hyperlink. So I like being able
Mhm.
to like click on something and then like get direction to the next part, and it just takes you through this rabbit hole that I that's just how I run my
Right.
life, I feel like. So I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? You mentioned a little bit earlier, Northwestern. You want to get into some of that?
Yeah, and I could probably answer a multitude of questions as I talk about this, and maybe we could just sort of go with it. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I teach photography. I teach photography at Northwestern University, where I've been since 1993. And at the point where I started this project, I had just completed a different project. And from one project to the next, photography became less and less relevant. As you can see, there's no such thing in this project.
Hmm.
There are no photographs at all of the Lincoln Park Cemetery, of the Chicago City Cemetery, which I was really stunned by because photography had already been invented at that point. So I was looking
Hmm.
for any visual evidence, and I ended up, it's an art project because that's my perspective. I'm not a historian. And so I tried to create a visualization of the cemetery through the stories and through the graphics and the maps that I used. And it turns out I'm an archaeologist, I learned, because that's
Yeah.
exactly how archaeologists reconstruct a place where there isn't evidence of it. They use the primary documents and maps and things to reconstruct. I didn't realize that. And I was a keynote speaker at an archaeological conference. And I learned that I'm an archaeologist. I'm also a historian. I'm also a genealogist. And all of those things, I mean, I've been called those things. I don't identify as such. But so the project that I did previous to this one was connected to a symposium that I co-organized about American street photography. And at that point, that was 2004, and we're really early in the kinds of resources that are now accessible online.
Hmm.
In 2003, that project launched in 2004. They were year long, so that I started it in 2003, and there was no Google Street View. I don't, Google Satellite might have just been introduced. There were no resources. And I started with this glass negative that I had of a street corner in New York. And I ended up building a whole website around the details in this photograph. And I used the New York Times archive, which is on ProQuest, which I thought I had privileged access to because of my university account, which I think at that point I did. And so I tried to I made a website about this street corner that was based on the material that I found in the New York Times historically. So that project launched in 2004. I did other things. I'm making photographs, I'm having exhibitions, I'm teaching my classes, I'm just sort of doing my thing. And in 2007, in February, I actually know the date, and I got in my car and I went and I filmed the couch tune. I discovered that the Tribune had put their archive online as well, which I didn't know
Hmm.
before. And I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
I could look for things. And what this means is there was this technology that's now pretty well known, maybe not by the name. It's called OCR technology, optical character recognition, where you can search by keyword in any document and it'll find words just by the way they look, not because they're looking at letters. So that's
Oh,
how
yeah.
you can find things in magazines and stuff now. It's a pretty common technology today.
Say
Wow.
I've
But
heard of it.
so
I
I
never heard the name before,
realized,
but it sounds
so I went to
familiar.
the tribute. Yeah, OCR
Yeah.
technology. So I went to the
Wow.
Tribune and I started like searching by keyword, and it went back to the 1850s, I think, in the Tribune that had been put up. And one of the first things I searched for is couch tomb because I wanted to know about the couch tomb. And I started reading about the Couch family in the 1860s. in the 1850s. And I searched the tomb and I learned there was a cemetery. And I was like, what? Because I knew about the couch tomb since I was a child in the 1960s, 100 years later, and nobody could tell me anything about it. I was a child. Coming off the Lakeshore Drive, LaSalle, just exactly how people
Right.
describe
Right.
it, just like you just had, said. And so I started searching by keyword, and I realized, like, you can sort them chronologically. I realized I could learn the story in the way that it happened. For the first time, nobody knew this story before. And so I'm like, wait a second, I've just discovered something that has never been told. It's not in history books. The history books actually tell a different story, like the game of telephone. By the time it got to whenever the history
Mm-hmm.
books were written, there was no more evidence. And it turned into a different kind of project because I wanted to know, how did we lose this history? What was actually there? And who's Ira Couch and who's in the tomb? And I had all these questions. And so when I started combining search terms with Lincoln Park and Chicago City Cemetery, when those all happened in the same article, it's because Lincoln Park had been established and some evidence of the cemetery had just been discovered, meaning they had dug in the park and found bones. And I
Mm-hmm.
found many stories like this, and I was like, wait a second. So there were satellite maps. So I downloaded a section of the satellite map that Google had. It's on the website. It's what I ended up
So that's
using.
like
And
your
I started putting
main
dots
image
on the
on the
map.
website, right?
Yeah, right. It's like the signature image. It's an overlay of a cemetery map over a Google satellite map from 2007. So even that looks different
Mm-hmm.
today. And so I put yellow dots wherever I could pinpoint the article explained that they had found bones. And soon enough, the map was polka dotted. And I'm like, there is a whole lot of bones still left in Lincoln Park. And then south of North Avenue, where the Catholic cemetery was, there are even more bones because what I learned, there weren't many bodies that were disinterred from that area. And all those beautiful, elegant homes, none of them have basements.
Mm.
Yes.
Oh, of course they don't.
Right?
And that's
Oh, that's
why they
funny.
didn't. And so one of the
Your
earliest, yeah.
your graphic of that polka dotted graphic, we'll put it on our Instagram so you all can see it. It's one of my favorite graphic. There's so many on the website because you, like you said, there's a dearth of like historical documents you've collated that are also cool. But the graph of really seeing the dots of where this stuff is fascinating. Like, so we'll make sure you guys all take a look at that too.
Yeah,
Well,
we talk
and
about
the
it a lot in
dots
our
actually,
episode
if you,
too.
they're rollover. The dots are rollover links. So if you hover over one of the dots, it should reveal the snippet of the story that identifies that spot and what they found and what the date
Oh, that's
was.
cool.
The
I didn't
problem
notice
with
that. I
this
have to go back
website being
now.
so old, it might not even be working anymore because this website is 17 years old. And I had flash animations and there's videos that I tried last night to play that don't play. I just have to find a new code to be able to do that. So some of the website isn't functioning the way it was at first. And maybe those rollover links aren't working, but I don't know. Try it. That was the whole
Say,
point.
I'll have to go
You
check it
should be
out.
able to roll over and see the dates. Yeah. So that's how the project, like, I realized I have something here. I have a story that hasn't been told. I'm tapping into this technology that is brand new, which is, and I make it a statement on my on this site where I say, as technology carries us into the future, it's also brought me into a hidden past. And so I was kind of in a race to get this done because I had thought I'm doing year-long projects at that point. And I applied for grants from Northwestern where I teach, and they gave me money, but the money didn't, like, I did everything. I did the research, I made the photographs of the documents, I
Hmm.
transcribed everything, I designed the website, I
They
populated
better.
the
They better.
website, I recorded interviews, I uploaded those. I did absolutely everything in 15 months. And I needed the extra time
Wow.
to get the permissions to put the markers in the park, get them fabricated, the $10,000 that I got was just for the markers in the end, to fabricate the markers, to pay somebody to dig the holes, which was the most expensive thing, and to yeah. And so I'm glad that they're still there because
I say I love
that's
that
where
they're
my
still there
costs were.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that they knew this project was meritorious of a grant, because I mean, you did, just like you said, all that work all by yourself,
Yeah.
and
Well,
at
yeah.
least they gave you
Well,
enough for some
my
markers.
my school gave me that money. Northwestern
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
gave me the
Northwestern.
grant, and as part of the stipulation of when they give granting monies, you have to acknowledge them. So if you see the historical markers, it actually says, Northwestern University. I got 2 grants to do that, and it's gold leaf,
Uh-huh.
and it's like in the park, and it wasn't supposed to still be there, but I'm thrilled that they are.
I
I
gotta
saw
go on
that
this
there's
walking
all beautiful
tour.
flowers around the tomb right now too, and it looks fantastic when you drive by right
Oh,
now.
that's interesting.
Yeah, they have I'm not sure if that little
That's
fence was there
new.
the whole time, but the flowers are gorgeous around it right now. I think they're pink and
The
yellow.
Well, we can talk about the tomb because that fence was part of a 1992 renovation,
Oh, was
and
it?
the tomb was. Well, let's talk about the tomb. What? Because you
Yeah.
said you had done already the previous episode about the tomb. So,
Yeah,
what?
well, one thing
Yeah.
that we know
My
is
question was kind of
Oh, go ahead,
answered.
Kelly. Oh, you
Oh,
ready?
I'm
Okay.
sorry. I was just gonna say, in this first question here, it was kind of answered.
I figure that'll
Um,
happen because I'm used to.
Yeah.
I teach 3-hour classes, and I'll keep talking to fill in the space,
Oh,
no
and I'll probably end
worries.
up answering all your questions and questions you didn't know you even had. So I'll stop
yeah.
talking to
I love
allow
that.
for
I'm
another
okay
question.
with that.
No, no.
So we do know that Ira Couch was a wealthy businessman, and he was known as the second wealthiest man in Chicago, from what I've found. I'm not sure if I found that in another article or your website. Um, but he gained the majority of his wealth from the Tremont, and he also owned property. Do you know where he owned this other property in the Chicago area, or just the fact that he did?
It's all downtown. All of Chicago at that point. Ira Couch died in 1858. Well before the Chicago fire. Downtown, Lake Street was like Main Street, and it sort of was close to the river, and all of that was downtown. There was nothing in Lincoln Park, which is why the cemetery went there, which could be a whole other story. But so he owned a lot of what we call the Loop was Chicago, basically, and
Oh,
that's
okay.
where.
Yeah.
And then it started growing outward. And North Avenue marked the northern boundary of Chicago. That's why it was named that. Fun fact. Western Avenue
Wow.
was the western boundary of Chicago.
So logical.
Division
I
Street
love it.
named the edge of a survey part. Yeah, so
Oh,
these
that's funny.
descriptive street names. So he owned, yeah, it's basically real estate, not even the Tremont House. It was the real estate that he owned. And and factors into also why the tomb is still there, if you want me to keep talking.
Yes, definitely. I would love to hear that.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
so Ira Couch died in Cuba, which maybe you talked about already.
Hmm.
And it also fascinated me, like how they got him back from Cuba, because I looked at maps during that time, and they had to there were, I don't think, trains that went that route anyhow. And
I was
my theory is
wondering
that he
that when
was
I
in an
was
iron
researching.
coffin. Yeah. Yeah, because it took him months to get back because he died in the winter because, like rich Chicagoans still today, they go away for the Chicago winters somewhere warm. Then he went to Cuba
I get
where
it.
he died. And so, something else interesting about the couch tomb that I asserted with this project that has never really, I think, been properly acknowledged is that it is the oldest standing structure in the Chicago fire zone. And it was made by a
Oh.
famous Chicago architect. I think it was Van Ostel. And there was a newspaper article that talked about, which helped me with my visualization when I would go to visit the site, 8 horses pulling the top of that mausoleum to that point from Clark
Oh,
Street.
wow.
The granite, the massive granite
Wow.
structure of that right? So he was very wealthy. When he built the tomb, he was still alive. The tomb was there. His father died. It's not clear who was in the tomb before he died or where they were buried. I think I have some of the um, documents showed that his family was already buried in the earlier part of the cemetery because the cemetery was already around for more than 10 years before he
Hmm.
died. And so he had it built when he had a lot of money, and it was massive. I mean, it's hard to call it massive when we see it in the landscape and it doesn't look that impressive to us with the scale surrounding it. But yeah, so what happened is he died in 1858, and he left a will that left everything, which was largely the real estate, in trust to his family for X number of years. And I think it was 25 years, where they couldn't sell anything, but they could reap the rents of the properties. So they were living off the properties that they owned,
Okay.
but they couldn't sell them to get the cash for 25 years. And what happens in 25 years? The Chicago fire wipes
Okay,
out
that makes
his
a
real
lot of
estate
sense.
holdings. The family has no money. They're probably really
Oh,
mad at him now.
Hmm.
that
So,
makes so much sense. We were
yeah,
like, what, how did that come about that all of a sudden, like, they were reaping the benefits, and then it's like, oh, of the Chicago fire hit, destroyed
yeah,
those benefits they were gathering.
right. And it's just because he wrote his will that way. He could have just, if he didn't have a will, probably they would just inherit it, then they could do whatever they want with it. But he specifically
Right.
said not to sell it. And probably that was, like, for investment purposes, a really smart thing, had the city not burned down. They would have
Right.
been,
You're
you know,
right.
10 times richer, because in that amount of time, the real estate would have been even huger. So they didn't have anything. And in one of your questions, it was like, I mentioned three things about this, um, the reasons why people think that it's still there. One was for political reasons, which I don't think the Couch family had any political clout at that point. Which at this point we're after the fire. The cemetery is basically gone. The Couch tomb is like the last thing there because other people had removed things. The fire had decimated things. There was a lot of activity on that ground. We're jumping really far ahead because we didn't really talk about, like, what the landscape looked like. But nobody would put up the money to get rid of that tomb, to disassemble the tomb. And one of the articles said that they would need to, like, blow it up because the
Wow.
rivets that were connecting the granite parts were so fused, and the thing was so massive. Oh, I think that I'm talking off the top of my head because it's been 17 years, but I think they said it was going to cost $3,000 to disassemble it at that time, which you could probably add a
That's
few zeros to, like, understand how much money that
Yeah, I
was. And
converted,
at
because it
that
was
point,
7,000 to build. I converted it, and it's 250,000 currently to build the same thing. Because
that's
I'm
not that
pretty sure it
much
was
for somebody
$7,000
who
to
died.
build it. I say it didn't feel like a,
Yeah,
a
which is
whole lot
nothing.
in comparison to like what
Right.
we know it is, but like that's a lot of money still.
Well, and if you're calling him a millionaire at that point, a millionaire would be a billionaire today. Like, if you
Oh,
think about, like,
absolutely.
who had $1 million when $7,000 was a lot of money. It's all
Exactly.
relative, right? And
yeah,
it made me
yeah.
wonder who the richest person was, if he was the second richest person. But it's because he was a
It was I
landowner,
looked it up.
right?
It
So
was two
everything kind of
people
went,
who were other hotel owners. They like combined two people to make the
oh,
richest person,
interesting.
according to an article. I don't know off the top of my head, but according to an article I found, they talked about two partners being the wealthiest people, and then Ira Couch being the second wealthiest.
Interesting.
I
I
can't
wish I could
believe.
remember
I
the
mean,
names.
I
This was a couple
can
weeks
because
ago.
it's so big and so grand. I, I'm really glad they didn't blow it up because
Me
it's
too.
so, like, beautiful, and even though, I mean, even though you said, like, scale wise it doesn't look like that big, once you've been here long enough and you realize what that actually is, you're like, that's a gigantic mausoleum. Like, that's
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
actually quite large.
Yeah.
And it makes total sense that they're like, Yeah, to get rid of that, we would have to detonate it because took 8 horses just to get the roof there.
Right, right, right. So yeah, yeah. So at that point when that was the last thing standing, the Lincoln Park commissioners had just taken over the land. It had belonged to the city, and this was the beginning of the Chicago Park District. So they didn't have the funds, the city didn't have the funds, the family didn't have the funds. And so the smoking gun that I talk about, like, why is it still there? Where I found a little snippet of an article that said basically, I mean, I could go right to the page, but I won't. It said basically, all evidence of the city cemetery is gone now except for Couch's tomb, and they have decided to plant trees thickly around it, I think was the term. So they were basically going to try to hide the tomb in the park, is what, like, nobody would move it, so let's just pretend it's not here in 1875, 80, whatever it was. And the park was designed differently at that point. The WPA project in the 1939, I think it was, when they made the LaSalle Street exit at North Avenue there, cut through the park. There's bridges where you walk under bridge. The whole area has been reconfigured multiple times. And at that point, the entrance to the park was up Dearborn, where the Lincoln statue is. Where if you stand where the Lincoln statue is and you look down Dearborn, that's the carriageway. And
Mm,
Chicago History Museum's main entrance faces the park because that was where you came in when they built the second or whatever iteration. It faces Clark Street now. That's the back of the original museum. So all of these changes kind of reconfigure what that place was, which makes it even more like hard to imagine what it looked like at that time. So it wasn't until and on my website about the Couch tomb, I actually have a page where you scroll to the right and you can see the original tomb. You can see it in the through the decades. And in the 1980s, like you could see you can't see it. There a
mm,
chain link fence was around it. There was ivy all over the fence. There were bushes. There were trees. They had effectively covered it up. And it was a point in Lincoln Park history in the 60s where Lincoln Park was a really seedy place. It's hard to imagine. Um, and there were like the equivalent of homeless people. It was like a shady place to be because you could hide in there. And so um,
right.
finally, in the early 1990s, the city got a grant and there was a private foundation that paid for the renovation, the lights that then light it, that reconstructed the iron fence around it, and put a spotlight on it. And all of a sudden, there's a monument there, which then brought the next generation of people's attention to it.
Could I interrupt you to ask what
Yeah.
might be a silly question?
Mhm.
So the fence has been restored and all of that. That's in an effort to keep people away from like touching the building and trying to go trespass. Yes or no?
Yes, probably, but it also reconstructed it as it appeared when it was made. So it's designed very similar to the original fence, although the original fence would have had a gate so that the family could
Okay.
actually access their tomb. And
Hmm.
um, I don't know if you know Adam Seltzer because he's the one that gives a lot of ghost tours and different Chicago
So that
tours,
name is
and
very
he
familiar. I've been
always
on a
sends
lot
me
of ghost
information
tours,
when he
so
learns
it's
something.
possible.
Yeah, he heads them up, and he writes books also about history, Chicago history, and creepy Chicago history. And whenever he finds something or learns something about the Lincoln Park area, he always lets me know, or he's like, "Did you know this?" And we share information, even though my project is history, so to speak. Um, he was the first one. He slid his iPhone underneath the door because you can. There's a space under the door, and there's a little lens on the phone, and you can still hold on to the phone and take a picture with the flash.
Oh,
And
that's
I used
funny.
to give tours of the park actually through the Chicago History Museum, and I did it for many years after the project launch until I stopped doing them at the beginning of the pandemic, and I haven't done them since. It's a mile-long tour that I would do. We would start at the south end and work our way all the way north. It's a mile, and it would be an hour tour. And I used to like to tell the story. So he slipped his phone under the door, And what do you think the camera recorded?
Oh
I'll just
goodness.
tell you.
I
Another
don't know.
door.
Yeah.
Oh.
So there are two
Another
doors.
door.
So the outside door would have probably been an iron gate, right?
Oh,
And
okay.
then you would see the door that the family would then access. So some of the things aren't how they appeared then because it looks
Oh,
impenetrable. And there's an iron door there and it looks like it's welded shut. So, I mean, they don't want vandals obviously going in there.
Right.
right.
And that was one of the things that is part of my project, and it being an art project, where I basically wanted to raise questions and I wanted people to think about things and I wanted them to, with the evidence that I provided, come up with their own sort of ideas. But I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to dig in the ground. I didn't want to like go out there with the, I did buy some of those, what do you call those, divining, those
Oh,
that
the
can
yeah,
catch all.
Dowsing
divining rods.
rods.
Yeah,
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 yeah.
I did. I don't know how to all people would contacted me a lot after this project to tell me about the ghost that they saw and stuff. But I do have a favorite story about the Ira Couch tomb because every Halloween, it seemed, for many years, I would get contacted around Halloween because my project would get highlighted because of the ghosts in the cemetery and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. And a few years ago, it was before the pandemic, maybe 6 years ago, it was always seemed to be Fox that was doing this because they always have more fanciful like programs. But Fox had hired a psychic to come out. And if I find this, I think it's still on YouTube. I can give you the link to it. So a psychic came out and went to the Couch tomb and divined Ira Couch. Actually, he talked to Ira. And they went to the baseball fields also and talked to the people who were buried in the Potter's Field. But he talked to Ira Couch, and Ira told him, I'm just saying this the way he told me. Ira told him that the reason that tomb is still there is that he was looking out over the abandoned graveyard. He was there as a sentry to all of the people who were buried there. And even better, what Ira told him, and this is why I'm telling the story, is that Ira told the psychic that he was waiting for me, Pamela Bannos, to come and do my project. And the psychic told me that I have really good karma because I have put tens of thousands of souls to rest by bringing them back to the foreground, telling their story, not losing their history, and that's why the tomb was still there, which I think is just the best story ever, obviously,
Oh,
because
I
it
love
involves me.
that.
But
That's an
yeah,
awesome
so it's
story.
yeah, and so when I first did this project it launched in 2008 and the media were there with, as I was putting the markers in the ground. And I think it was Fox that said, "Whose fault is this?" like trying to turn it into a news story. Like, why are all these graves still here? Whose fault is this? Which is also addressed on the website. But I've just gone all in many different directions, which is what happens in this. And maybe we should talk about the cemetery itself too, and contextualize the Ira Couch tomb, or if you have a specific question about that, because it's a big messy story. Like, when did it start? When did it end? Why are they still there? Why is he the only evidence? And the David Kennison boulder. So
Yeah,
is
I
there
do
like a
have.
specific direction?
Sam, yeah.
Yeah, I actually we spent a good amount of time in our episode talking about resurrectionists and specifically the whole Alan Pinkerton kind of takedown of the city sexton. Um was it fairly common, do you know, if there that resurrectionists would kind of go to city cemeteries specifically, cuz there were two other previous kind of cemeteries in Chicago before this one? Or was this kind of the main one that was
Right.
targeted?
Well, okay, so the history of Chicago, parallel to the history of these cemeteries, grew exponentially. The two cemeteries prior to this one, of which those graves were removed to this one, well, there's one person,
Mhm.
and I think it's Kinsey, who was moved like 5 times, and he's now in Graceland Cemetery. Like he was in the original cemetery, then he was moved to the Lincoln Park Cemetery, then he was moved to Rose Hills. And then he was moved again, and it was fairly common, I guess, to do that. Like if a family moved to California, they would take their dead family with them.
Oh,
They'd like,
wow.
yeah, it was, yeah, yeah. Just apparently that
It
was a
was
thing.
actually that was one of the questions that I moved to the bottom. I saw it on your website, and I was like, But again, it's there's so much there that
Yeah,
people moved all the time.
right.
Um,
So the North
but
and the
so
South
fascinating.
it is. The whole thing is nuts. So the North and the South cemeteries were, just to give you a sense on what North and South was at that time, pre-1843, which is when this cemetery in Lincoln Park was established. The South Cemetery was at the site of today's McCormick Place, and the North
Oh, okay.
Cemetery was at the site of the Hancock Building, which I guess we call it something else, except I still call it the Hancock Building. That was the North and the South. Like,
Yeah,
it's
very short
still kind
distance
of what
between the
we
two.
almost consider the
Yeah.
loop area. Yeah. So, and then there were cemeteries before that, when Chicago, less before it was even incorporated, and they buried them in the bank of the Chicago River, which was just like, there was no organized anything. And so when they built, like, underground Wabash, they were always finding things, when they were started construction of bigger buildings along the river. There were no cemeteries the way we understand them until about the Victorian era. There were graveyards on family plots. There were church graveyard. They were associated with churches. Or if you had a family farm, you'd have the family cemetery. In fact, that
Mhm.
accounts for part of the Lincoln Park Cemetery. 12 acres of the cemetery was first a farm families. That's a whole other podcast episode.
So we
The Milliman
briefly mentioned
Tract
that,
is
very
a whole
briefly.
story. Yeah, it's like another complicated story, because there were the 5 members of the Milliman family were already buried there when, and one of them died in the Civil War. There's a whole history of those 12 acres, and those 12, oh, I won't even go into it because I'm already distracted by that. So the the North and the South graveyard burials were reinterred in Lincoln Park. They were the first burials in the Lincoln Park Cemetery when it was established, because they wanted to build on that area. It was now part of the city. So let's get rid of these graves and put them over there, because it's just like it was more common to do that. So that established the first graveyard. At that point, they made some sort of an edict that graveyards were going to be outside city limits, which is why they did it on the other side of North Avenue. The Catholic Church already owned the grounds on the southern border of North Avenue, from north south to Burton Street, I think, and from Dearborn to the lake, which is today's Astor Street, was the Catholic cemetery. The what we call the Cardinal's Mansion, which was the bishop's mansion, sits on 1/8 of the original Catholic cemetery. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's like the most expensive real estate in Chicago, right at
Yeah.
North Avenue. And I put a historical marker there. I went a block away, so I wasn't obnoxious, to say, look across the street. That's the Cardinal's Mansion. This is where the Catholics buried and left many, many, many people behind in the ground. So yes, are you going to say something?
Could
I
I
see.
could yeah, I was just could I ask you a question
Yeah,
related, since we're
sure.
talking about building these buildings and where the original cemeteries were. You've answered this a little bit, but when this is all uncovered, these bodies, when they are building the buildings, does the city bring in like archaeologists to
Today,
help with these remains, or
well, I've heard so many
do you know?
stories. I've heard so many stories, and so many stories off the record, that every time you dig in that Gold Coast area, um, you're going to find something. Because those are very wealthy people that live there, and some of them have taken the tour that I used to give, and they're like, yeah, everybody has some bones in their house, on their mantle, that they found in their garden. So, like, or someone.
So yeah,
Big seller. One of the earliest articles that I read was they were putting in a sewer line on Dearborn Street, which was the edge of the Catholic cemetery. And it said they found row after row of coffins. Like
Oh,
there was
wow.
no attempt. And so the only way you find something is if you dig, and you have to dig low enough. In some places that you dig 18 inches and you'll find it. We talk about 6 feet under. They find them at different depths depending on where they were, which is another question because they kept surfacing because of being close to
Mm-hmm.
the lake. It was the worst place to put a cemetery as well. And where they buried the potter's field, which is where they buried the poor or the unclaimed bodies or the mass graves that they had during cholera and smallpox outbreaks, where they would do trench burials because there were so many people dying before they could actually go through a proper burial, and they didn't still at that point understand contagious diseases and how they spread. So they just needed to bury these people so that the whole city wouldn't get sick. Um, we, I mean, we could just talk about this the way the website is from any
I,
which direction because,
I,
yeah, we could talk
I
like the
just,
way yeah, I know it's
I
in
pictured.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. I just pictured. I was like, it must be so hard if they're digging, 18 inches in the ground. They're finding a sewer pipe. We're in the middle of Chicago. Can't really bring in a real archaeologist with like a brush and like
Yeah.
and it excavates and
Mm-hmm.
So
so it makes sense.
in 1998, they did the Chicago History Museum, which is ironically on the cemetery grounds, the history of Chicago and this in the history. When it was built in 1932, they found all kinds of bones and skeletons. There's a photograph on my site from 1932. So you see like fedoras and they look like gangsters on the curb. They've reconstructed an entire skeleton. They've like rearticulated a skeleton on the
Oh,
sidewalk,
wow.
and they're all posing like it was, Halloween. And that's how different it was in 1932. And so in
Mm-hmm.
1998, when the Chicago History Museum was building their parking facility, when they knew at that point the history of Chicago well enough to know that this was a graveyard, they had to hire an archaeologist for that project because they were excavating I don't know how many 4-acre plot of land. And by 1998, there were different laws in place because I found earlier
Right.
records that said things like park workers have from time to time found bones and they've always put them back where they found them, which is actually the correct thing to do, turns out, according to
Mm-hmm.
archaeologists. Right? So in 1998, would you like me to tell this story because it's fascinating?
Oh, I'm
If you have
happy just
time,
to hear you tell any
If you
story
want
throughout
to.
this. I'm fascinated with everything.
Okay,
yeah,
so it relates to resurrectionists. It relates to Iron Coffin. It relates to
cool.
everything because it's a contemporary story of the old cemetery. So by that time, well, in 1989, which is another kind of approach to answering your question, Illinois enacted the Human Skeletal Remains Protection Act, which means anything you find in the ground in the state of Illinois that's more than 100 years old belongs to Illinois. It needs to be going to Springfield Museum. And
Oh,
it
Oh,
interesting.
mostly
okay.
has to do with Native American burial ground types of things. So we don't
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of history like that, definitely in Chicago. But artifacts belong to the state, basically, for like, artifact hunters. So that
Right.
just covers everything when they say that. So they knew that they were going to find something. They didn't know what they were going to find. So they had to hire an archaeologist to sort of pre-treat the ground. Let's have a look before we do this, what exactly we're getting involved with. So they had a head archaeologist and different people, and they do what's called scoop tests. And this is what they would do on any construction site or on any area where they might think there might be something related to cemeteries. And they had this tiny backhoe which scoops out what sounds like the equivalent of a grave. It sounds like it's like 6 foot wide and 6 foot deep that they go, and they scoop in sort of either random places or on the perimeter of where they're going to be working. They scoop out the ground and then they sift through what they find. And if they found evidence of full skeletons, they were going to need to do a complete archaeological dig, like the kind you see of them doing in Pompeii or whatever. And they did
Right.
this in random places, and they found enough evidence. They didn't find like tons of things, but they found enough evidence to say they were going to encounter bones, which meant if they knew that, that's the key. Now that they know that, they have to proceed in the proper way. So they
Right.
had a team of archaeologists with the construction people as they're like scooping out to build this garage, which is partially subground. So every time the backhoe
Whoa.
would dig something
Oh.
out, the archaeologists would sift through, and they ended up filling. And I visited downstate, um, putting what they found, which are bones, and at least 10 skulls they found, that they put in Ziploc bags and banker boxes, which is how they're stored offsite downstate Illinois. The archaeologists don't like that. They're like, put them back in the
Yeah.
ground near where you found them, because this is the reason that they're buried there. This is not like a museum exhibit, which is very taboo now. Yeah.
It's a
And
resting
Mm-hmm.
place.
yeah, and it's, the Chicago Historic, what was the Chicago Historical Society, and which is now the Chicago History Museum, actually has a skeleton of a Chicagoan in their collection, which is pretty taboo. And I think
Wow.
they might have off deascensioned it by now.
Or put it in that. I looked through you last Sam for a second. I
Yeah,
should
I
probably
noticed that.
reconnect. Her internet
Oh wait,
isn't great, but I got the recording so I can download the audio and we can keep talking.
I should
Um,
be back.
I
Oh, go ahead.
I'll text her. Sue, she texted me. I just was she texted me. She's gonna tell me she says she lost connection. She's gonna reconnect.
Okay.
She's her internet is yeah,
Spotty.
but yeah, spotty. When you mentioned just the archaeological aspect of it, I was like, we have so much underground here, like the every scoop, like you just said, of the backhoe must have been like
Yeah,
something, like
yeah.
it
Yeah.
must have taken like every like single one, but like I'm sure they couldn't do that as far as time and how
Well,
time
that's the
progresses.
thing. Yeah, that's the thing, that if they're on a schedule, that puts everybody, and costs go crazy.
Hey everyone, Sam from the future here again. We, as Kelly mentioned briefly here, I had some connection issues, and this unfortunately caused the remaining audio to be corrupted. So we actually had a follow up with Pamela. She was incredibly gracious to hop back on a call with us. So we're going to be picking up here. So there's going to be a little bit of a jump in our conversation, but we're trying to pick up right where we had left off. And again, I hope you guys continue to enjoy. We were talking a lot about just the process of moving the remains and really kind of who had to pay for it. Can you tell us a little bit about just how that process worked?
So the reason that this history is convoluted and um, it's not even complex, it's just that it's unknown, is that when people bought their cemetery lots, they bought them as family plots, meaning they bought enough space to dig, I think, either 9 or 12 graves, or 6 or 12 graves, depending on what era it was. Later, they were 12 graves. They started 6 graves. So 6 graves is whatever amount of square footage that is on the ground. And they bought them like pieces of real estate. So
Hmm.
that's why it was so difficult to get to like reclaim the grounds, because the people who bought the grounds owned the ground, so they couldn't do anything with
Right.
it. So they tried to
Oh.
give
Mm-hmm.
the people who they wanted to take their graves away out of the what was becoming the park. Or actually, even better, there were new cemeteries that were being established, the first private cemeteries, and the first one was Rose Hill. And so when Rose Hill opened, they were giving people incentives to remove their families from the Lincoln Park graveyard to Rose Hill. And so they were doing it for free and giving them the same size plots in Rose Hill. So the
Oh,
incentive was, if you
okay.
bring your family over here, you'll be in this beautiful new place and it'll be tended to and
Hmm.
so forth. So a lot of people took advantage of that. I don't think it cost the people anything, but when they vacated the grounds, they defaulted back to, at that point, whoever owned those grounds, whether it was the city of Chicago and then eventually the Lincoln Park Commissioners. So they were given the opportunity to have same size plots in the new cemeteries, and that's how it started. That part of the history. So that's in the 1860s
Okay.
now.
That makes a lot of sense. And we talked a bit about how the couch tomb is really the last standing structure in the fire zone. And a lot of the other headstones were damaged in the fire. And what was the process of there's so many headstones that were damaged? How did that go just about trying to identify where who was buried in those areas to then continue to move them?
Right. So regarding the Chicago fire, and the couch tomb is actually
Yes.
the earliest remaining structure, the earliest remaining structure in the Chicago fire zone. So it was put there in 1858, which makes it really historic worthy in Chicago. So what happened by 1871, when the big Chicago fire basically stopped at Lincoln Park, because at Fullerton there were still trees. It was still sort of a wooded area, and it served as a breaker, so the fire didn't continue northward. And so what happened were
Okay.
many of the graves were apparently wooden, or wooden crosses, or just sort of rudimentary markings,
Oh.
and so they got
Oh.
burned. But more importantly, the stories go that people were running northward and into the lake to escape the flames. And they trampled over the grave markers, and things got kind of put in disarray. And
Oh.
what I learned is the only way you know where there is a grave is if there's a standing marker in place, because it marks that something's below the ground. So once the
Mm.
markers got
Mhm.
burnt or removed, or they crumpled, and marble is a very soft stone, so not only did it crumple, it's easy to knock over, but it eroded, and then you lose the detail of, like, the names and the dates and so forth. So the Chicago fire was ultimately what caused the graveyard to sort of get cleaned up in terms of the errant, the sort of disarray of the markers and stuff, and from people running there from the fire, like with their furniture and dragging things, and like really messing up the grounds, essentially. There are stories, and I don't know how true they are, but there's a section on my website that refers to the Chicago fire, and it's every time I found any reference to the cemetery during the fire, I aggregated that and put it on the website. And one of the legends is that people were jumping into open graves to avoid
Oh,
the
wow.
the the fire.
Oh.
And
Oh
that
my.
that mean not open graves like that were ready to have someone buried, but open graves that suggest that there was the disinterring that was happening at that time. So there was an acknowledgement that
Oh,
graves were being
interesting.
removed from the park, which I found very little news about. They weren't, recording, there goes another casket up Clark Street to Rose Hill or to Graceland Cemetery, which was, sort of a realization that I mentioned, that, like, why wasn't there news about the disinterring? How did we lose this history? And what I came to the conclusion was that it
Right.
was going on for so long, for 10 years at least, from 1860, when the new cemeteries opened, through the fire more than 10 years later. There were thousands of graves that were being emptied. And I think maybe they were building new boxes for them because, they were underground for that amount of time and they didn't have vaults. But there was a
Mm-hmm.
constant stream of like horse wagons carrying coffins up Clark Street and down to Oakwood Cemetery.
This kind of became
So
normal.
yeah, that I don't think it was news for them to be reporting. There goes another casket
Mm-hmm.
up Park Street. So it was just such a common thing that it was just sort of taken for granted. And as a result, that kind of history doesn't get recorded. History gets recorded when something noteworthy happens, and that was just, what was going on at that
Mm-hmm.
time.
And much more recently, there were stories of people, park employees, removing headstones when they believed that area was clear and the disinterments were complete. But there's some uncertainty when it comes to whether they were actually complete. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so by the 1880s, I think it was, and I don't have my website in front of me, which is literally all my research. There were still what they were counting as 150 grave markers scattered throughout the park. We're now 10, 15 years after the Chicago fire. The 1880s, the park grounds, you can actually find postcards and pictures of the park, although I've never seen any pictures where you see gravestones there. And the Lincoln Park commissioners finally said, there's all these gravestones still in the park. And that's because they didn't own the ground. They were still waiting for the families to come and claim that space because, again, it's real estate. There's like people, basically with like real estate
Mm-hmm.
scattered throughout the park. So at that point, the Lincoln Park commissioners, and I found this in the Chicago Park District vaults, the archive there, they actually wrote down the names of, or the numbers of every plot, every family plot that had not been claimed, which gave me some idea on what could still be underground that hadn't been disturbed. It didn't say that they were necessarily all filled, and each number could represent 6 or 12 graves, but there were like 3 pages of the numbers of each of these family plots that they were making
Oh,
like a
wow.
proclamation that they were going to condemn the grounds that held those graves. And so they no longer belong to the families. They now belong to the park, and the park could do whatever they want. Like the statute of limitations was up. They had done their diligence, and now like this is no longer a graveyard. This is now the park. And what they did was they took the graves that matched each of the markers that were still left in the park, and they disinterred them, and then they reinterred them in a very organized little graveyard with 150 markers just north of the South Field House, because I found a newspaper article that said that that's where they put them. And then a few
Mm-hmm.
years later, there was another notice in the Lincoln Park Commissioner minutes where like a new commissioner was like, can we get rid of what they were calling the graveyard in the park? Like it's so clearly articulated little graveyard with 150 markers and I don't know how many graves. And so the new commissioner basically said, can we just get rid of this graveyard? Because it's unsightly and we have a park here now. And so what they did was they removed the markers so it didn't look like a graveyard anymore. But they didn't dig anything out at that point. So that article
Oh,
told me that
Oh no.
still today there is a very structured like graveyard just north of the South Field House that that's still there without any evidence above ground.
do you have an
That's
estimate
wild.
of how many remains may still be in the park?
I was asked that right as my project launched because I had to come up with a number. And I have a section on the website called The Numbers where I did my best so that I wouldn't get backlash at the things that I was asserting. And so I read mortality records and I basically figured out how many people were buried there, which I figured were about 35,000 just based on the mortality records. And I literally copied down the name of every single person who was reinterred in Graceland Cemetery because they still have those records. And basically, just bottom line, I asserted that they left around 12,000 graves in the park. And they're mostly,
Ooh,
Wow.
yeah, I'm saying that like,
great day in the morning, y'all.
Yeah. They're mostly, I believe, in the area which are the baseball diamonds that are still there today. And that ground has been baseball
Which is
diamonds.
just close to the couch tomb overall, close
Yeah,
to across the
under,
street, right? That's
yeah,
where those are.
yes. And so Dearborn Street, which cuts through the Dearborn Street, which continues directly up to the Lincoln statue. And then if you look at a satellite map, it sort of lines up with the edge of the baseball diamonds. Um, to the east of Dearborn was the Potter's Field, which is where the common graveyards were, where they buried cholera victims, and they buried people who they couldn't
Hmm.
identify or people who couldn't afford a family plot. So those are the ones that are probably still there, and you can the actual infield of a, or how did I don't know how I read this. There's like the when you look at an infield on a traditional baseball field, the part that's all sand, that's the equivalent of like 1 acre.
Hmm.
The whole field is. And apparently there can be 1,000 graves in that amount of space because they're buried so close
Wow.
next to each other, and you only need 3 feet across. So if it's actually full, there could be so many more graves than you could imagine just because of how they pack things together. And during those epidemics of
Right.
smallpox and cholera, they had trench burials because they didn't understand yet how the the contagions worked. So they just were really quick to bury these
Hmm.
bodies before they spread whatever diseases they were carrying.
And then just kind of one last question to bring it all around. And we did briefly mention this previously, but what is your main theory on why the couch tomb was left in Lincoln?
Um, I think it was left because nobody would take responsibility for removing it. And at that point, when they were still talking about removing it, it was not the last thing that was still there. There were other vaults in that area. Maybe not up until the point where they basically said everything is gone except the couch tomb. As they were building up to that, that area where the couch tomb is are where other family tombs were. And I read an article that talked about the family tomb of C.D. Peacock, the jeweler in Chicago. So the Peacock tomb was not that
Hmm.
far from there. And there were other smaller tombs because I found articles that said that the Lincoln Park gardeners were storing their tools in there, like a tool shed. I think maybe they had been emptied, but it
Oh
was a
my goodness.
Right.
yeah. And people used to think that the couch tomb was what we called a comfort station, which is like a place where there are bathrooms
Oh,
because there's
wow.
a structure sitting in the middle of nowhere or in the middle of a field or however it
Hmm.
was. So the couch tomb, because at the time it was built, the Couch family were, millionaires. It was so massive that they couldn't, nobody could afford to do it. And it was at the time when the Lincoln Park commissioners were taking over. And they asked the family, and the family didn't have the money, and the Lincoln Park commissioners didn't have the money. And I think that's the reason. But the reason that it's still there, I mean, decades later, nobody, and still today, nobody moved it. You can still remove it. Now we embrace the history of it. But up until the
I'm
early
glad it wasn't
1990s,
moved.
yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, so until 1992, when they cleared out all of the mess around it, because the article that I read that was the smoking gun for me said all of the everything from the cemetery has now been removed except for Couch's tomb, and they have decided to plant trees thickly around it, is the quote. So their goal was to just let's hide the tomb, just hide it in the park, and let's pretend it's not there, which
We'll
saved
just
it.
have a
And
we'll have
so
a sneaky tomb.
yeah, let's pretend this tomb isn't here, and then of course we still don't know. And topographical maps that I looked at showed like the size of the trees that were planted around it in the 1980s when there was this topographical. There's like little cloud shapes that represent trees, and there's like all clouds all around the tomb itself. And like in the 1920s, they put like a chain link fence around it, and it just became like weeds, and it was just like a mess. I have photographs that show sort of the how it changed through the decades, and by the 1980s you really couldn't see it anymore. It was so surrounded by
Oh,
bushes and
wow.
things. And also the park has been reconfigured a number of times. In the 1930s is when they put in that North Avenue exit on Lakeshore Drive that cuts right in front of it. And all of a sudden, you're driving off the drive at the LaSalle Street extension and you see it right there. But that wasn't built until that was a WPA project to reconstruct that. Which you'll also notice by the
Oh,
couch tomb,
interesting.
if you walk to the baseball diamonds, you're walking underneath an overpass. You're walking underneath that extension.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been massive excavation of those grounds where that the different construction crews and road crews and park ground crews have always been like discovering bones underground. And a lot of that was reported on, and most of it was not reported on. And the different things that I heard from different people about, or even the acknowledgement in some newspaper articles, there isn't a year that goes by that the park workers don't find bones underground. They just leave things where they are and continue with their work, which is actually
Oh
what
my
archaeology,
goodness.
yeah, I mean, it seems weird, like, oh, here's a human bone, let's just put it back. But that's what the
Right.
archaeologists want you to do. They don't want you to,
Oh,
yeah.
That's the
right. That
respectful
makes
way to
sense.
do it.
Yeah, and you may touch and break something or destroy, the oils in your hands might destroy some stuff. Maybe I get that.
Well, you're altering history basically, because that
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
history. It's sort of
Mm-hmm.
like graveyards. You would think were meant to stay where they are, although it wasn't that
Mhm.
often to be moving graves around. But yeah, so the couch tomb was meant to um, was not meant to be moved, and so in retrospect, or it turns out that it's kind of the best thing that it didn't. And there's something interesting, and that was the link, that was the spark to the project, because I was like, what is this tomb? I finally, everybody's been asking that through the decades. And finally, I had access to the newspapers and the records to actually answer that question. But there are actually two things in the park that point to the grounds being formerly a cemetery. And they mark sort of the whole distance of the park. They mark the perimeter of the park. At the south, there's the couch tomb. And at the north, at Wisconsin Street, there's that boulder that we're not going to get into, but there's a boulder
No, that's a whole
recognizes
nother
this,
story.
yeah, this man David Kennison. There's a plaque that actually says he's buried nearby. So
No.
why haven't people asked, why is somebody buried in the park? And that's been
Where?
there. That's right at Clark and Wisconsin Street,
Yeah, and
which is
you're
like,
like, wait, where? Where is he buried
nobody
nearby? What?
where and why, right? And
Yeah,
so,
what? Wait.
Right?
and people didn't question that, and all of that's in the project. So and David Kennison fits in the project, which is called Hidden Truths, because of his truths and things that were hidden. And you could link to the David Kennison story because it's incredible, but he is like his whole own thing. But he's in the park, he's buried in the park.
Yeah. When I was speaking with my grandma, before we officially started this episode, I had mentioned that she was born in 1926. She had no idea it was formerly a cemetery. And she was
Wow.
blown away when I told her the
Wow.
story. Um, yeah, and so even back in the 20s and 30s when she was a little kid, it still wasn't really talked about apparently because she had no clue. And she lived a couple miles
Right.
down the road.
After my project launched, a number of years after my project launched, they found more bones on Astor Street or somewhere where the Catholic cemetery was. And the Tribune contacted the History Museum to ask them what they might know about this history. And my marker is right there on State Street and North Avenue that tells the whole story. And the story has been told, but still, it's just like you need, a good PR person because the story has been told.
Yeah.
People don't know the story, and people still don't know the story. And right where they found the bones, not that far away, is this big giant plaque that explains what these grounds were. And then the people at the History Museum were like, I think it might have been a cemetery. I'm like, I put a plaque right outside your window. You could have
The plaque is there.
the plaque is there. Yeah.
Check it
So
out. Read the
Oh, that's
signs.
funny.
yeah. And to be fair, your
That's great.
grandmother would have been going to Lincoln Park at a time when the tomb would have not been visible. And they did a really good job of erasing the
Yes,
history.
exactly. Yeah, she was fascinated. We talked for hours just about all of this, and she was
Yeah.
fascinated hearing everything. Um, but I want to thank you so much for hopping back on with us. Is there anything that
Yes,
you
thank
want to
you.
shout out? I know you have a book, your socials, anything like that.
I'm working on something right now, but I'm not really divulging any of it. But since this project came out, I've done a number of things, including I wrote a biography of a photographer who was in Chicago for most of her life, named Vivian Meyer, that a lot of people know.
Ooh.
Yeah, so I
Is
did. I did.
that is that all under wraps, or do you have a website for that
Oh,
as well? That's
that
fascinating.
that book came out in 2017. I worked for 5 years on
So
that.
excellent.
Um,
I'm a prolific reader.
I have
That
it
is
reserved at the
exciting.
Chicago Library.
it's at the Chicago History.
Cool.
The book is called Vivian Meyer: A Photographer's Life and Afterlife. And then
That
in the
is
last
awesome.
5 years, I did a podcast series where I talked about the life of a 19th century photographer, Alice Austin, through the letters that were written to her that were found like 50 years after she died. So I had voice actors reading from the letters to
Oh,
story, and that's a 10-part podcast series that I did. And that's called My
that's
Dear
brilliant.
Alice. Yeah,
My
it was
dear Alice,
My
I
Dear
saw
Alice.
that. I wasn't sure if that one was out yet or if you're still working on
Yeah,
that one. I
that
saw it on
was
the website and I was like,
yeah,
ooh.
yeah. I launched that in 2022. It's a 10-part series. It's long. I mean, they're half-hour episodes, and it's a narrative project, so it tells the whole story. And
Mhm.
the first
It's
and the last.
extremely cool you hired voice actors to do it too. That is very cool. I also just on your behalf, if I may, students going to Northwestern, take a class with Pamela Bannos. She's fantastic professor. Pamela Bannos. She is fantastic, and we've learned so much from her. I could talk to you all day about Chicago history, but I just wanted to shout that out. Like, if you're going through your classes, pick Pamela Bannos, Professor Bannos's class. She's knows what's up.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun. This might be one of the most fun episodes I think I've done in my research. So I want to thank
Well,
you so much for joining us for that. And I'm excited. We have a lot of Chicago listeners. So I'm very excited to
We
get
do.
this out, and hopefully more people can learn about the history of their city.
sounds great. Thank you for finding me.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Like just like Sam said, yeah.
Thank you all for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow our show on Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHATC, or you can email us at Have You Heard About This Case at gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.
Bye.